The morning sun cast long shadows across the sidewalk as Mrs. Eleanor Jenkins carefully made her way down Main Street. At 72, she moved a bit slower these days, but she still took pride in handling her own errands. Today's mission was simple: a visit to First National Bank to withdraw some money for her sister's medical bills. Eleanor smoothed down her lavender dress and adjusted her favorite pearl earrings, a gift from her late husband. She always dressed properly for trips to the bank, a habit from her 40 years as a school teacher when appearances mattered. The familiar weight of her handbag hung in the crook of her arm, containing her neatly organized wallet, checkbook, and the withdrawal slip she had filled out at her kitchen table that morning. "I can handle this myself," she had told her son over the phone earlier. He had offered to drive into town to help her, but Eleanor valued her independence. "It's just a simple withdrawal, dear. I've been banking there since before you were born." Her son, a successful attorney with a busy schedule, had sounded worried. "You sure, Mom? I can move some things around and meet you there." "Absolutely not," Eleanor had replied firmly. "You focus on that big case of yours. I'm perfectly capable of visiting my own bank." As she approached the grand stone building that housed First National, Eleanor felt a familiar sense of confidence. This place had been a constant in her life through raising a child alone, putting him through college, and seeing him become the successful man he was today. She had opened her first account here with her teacher's salary in 1982 and had faithfully saved enough to help with her son's education and her own retirement. The heavy glass doors opened with a whoosh of cool air. Inside, the bank buzzed with Friday afternoon activity. Young professionals on lunch breaks, other retirees like herself, and harried parents with children in tow all waited in the winding line for the next available teller. Eleanor took her place in line, patiently waiting her turn while observing the changes in the bank. New computers, younger staff, and a modern seating area had replaced the old wooden benches she remembered from decades past. Still, many faces were familiar. Tammy, the teller who usually handled Eleanor's transactions, waved from her window. 20 minutes later, Eleanor reached the front of the line, withdrawal slip and ID ready in hand. But instead of being directed to Tammy's window, the floor manager guided her to a desk off to the side. "Mrs. Jenkins, we have a new branch manager who would like to assist you today," the young man said, gesturing toward an office with glass walls where a middle-aged white man in an expensive-looking suit sat reviewing documents. Eleanor followed, slightly confused by the change in routine, but not wanting to make a fuss. She had always been treated with respect here, even as the bank changed ownership and staff over the years. "Good afternoon," she said politely as she entered the office. "I just need to make a withdrawal today." The new manager, a Mr. Richard Keller, according to the nameplate on his desk, barely looked up as Eleanor took a seat across from him. When he did, his gaze seemed to linger on her face a moment too long, his expression shifting subtly. "And how can I help you?" he asked, his tone noticeably cooler than his words. Eleanor placed her withdrawal slip on the desk and slid it forward. "I need to withdraw this amount from my savings account. My sister needs help with some medical expenses." Keller picked up the slip, his eyebrows raising slightly as he read the amount. Something in his demeanor changed, a tightening around his mouth, a narrowing of his eyes. What should have been a 5-minute transaction was about to become something Eleanor couldn't have anticipated. She had no idea that across town, her son had just wrapped up his court case early and, feeling uneasy about their earlier conversation, had decided to surprise her at the bank after all. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the sudden silence as Keller looked from the withdrawal slip to Eleanor and back again, his expression growing increasingly skeptical with each passing second. The silence stretched uncomfortably as Mr. Keller examined Eleanor's withdrawal slip. She sat with her back straight, hands folded neatly in her lap, the way she had taught her students to sit during important conversations. After what felt like an eternity, he finally spoke. "This is quite a large sum," he said, his voice carrying a hint of disbelief. "Almost $5,000. Eleanor nodded calmly. "Yes, I'm aware of the amount. My sister needs help with her heart medication. It's expensive, but I have the money in my account." Keller leaned back in his chair, twirling a pen between his fingers. "And you're absolutely certain about this amount? Sometimes numbers can be confusing." A slight frown creased Eleanor's forehead. In 40 years of managing her classroom budget and personal finances, no one had ever suggested she might be confused about numbers. "I'm quite certain," she replied evenly. "I've been balancing my own checkbook since before you were hired, young man." Something flickered across Keller's face, annoyance, perhaps, or something worse. He tapped a few keys on his computer, his eyes scanning the screen. "I see you've been with this bank for quite some time," he noted, not looking at her. "But protocols have changed. For withdrawals of this size, we need to take extra precautions." Eleanor reached into her purse and pulled out her driver's license and bank card. "I have my identification right here." Keller barely glanced at them. "Yes, but that's just the first step. We need to ensure that certain customers understand exactly what they're doing with their money." The emphasis he placed on certain customers wasn't lost on Eleanor. She'd heard that tone before, in grocery stores when she'd tried to return items, at restaurants when she'd complained about cold food, and now, apparently, at her own bank of 40 years. "I understand perfectly what I'm doing with my money, Mr. Keller," Eleanor said, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. "My sister needs medication, and I have the funds to help her." By now, several customers waiting in line had begun to glance curiously toward the glass office. Eleanor felt their eyes on her, adding to her discomfort. Keller's voice rose slightly. "Perhaps you'd like to discuss this with a family member first. Someone who might help you make financial decisions. We see a lot of scams targeting people in your demographic." The implication hung in the air between them. Eleanor's hands tightened in her lap. In all her years, through raising a child alone after her husband died, putting her son through law school on a teacher's salary, managing her retirement funds, no one had ever suggested she wasn't capable of handling her own money. "My demographic," Eleanor repeated, her voice quiet but firm. "And what demographic would that be, Mr. Keller? Retired school teachers, widows, or were you referring to something else entirely?" A thin sheen of sweat appeared on Keller's forehead. "I just meant elderly customers often need additional guidance." "I see," Eleanor said, though she saw all too clearly what he meant. "Then perhaps you can guide me through why this transaction is any different from the one I made last year for my roof repairs. That was $8,000, and no one questioned me then." Keller shuffled some papers on his desk, avoiding her gaze. "Different manager, different protocols. And frankly, this withdrawal pattern seems unusual for someone in your situation." "My situation?" Eleanor felt her patience wearing thin. "Mr. Keller, I've banked here for 40 years without incident. I know exactly how much money I have and exactly what I intend to do with it." Keller's expression hardened. "Perhaps you'd like to come back with a family member who can help you understand your finances better," he said loudly enough that heads turned in the lobby. "Someone who can ensure you're not being taken advantage of." The humiliation washed over Eleanor like cold water. Several bank customers were openly staring now. A young woman in line looked uncomfortable, while an older man shook his head slightly. Eleanor opened her mouth to respond when the bank's front door swung open. She couldn't see who had entered, but something in Keller's expression changed as his eyes focused on someone behind her. "Mom?" A familiar voice called out. "Everything okay over here?" Relief flooded through Eleanor as she turned to see her son, walking toward the glass office, his briefcase in one hand and concern written across his face. Eleanor's son crossed the bank lobby with purposeful strides, his presence commanding attention. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with a leather briefcase in hand, he looked every bit the accomplished attorney he was. Relief washed over Eleanor's face as he approached, though she also felt a twinge of embarrassment that he was seeing her in this situation. "I thought you were in court today," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Finished early," he replied, his eyes quickly taking in the scene, his mother's tense posture, the manager's defensive stance, the paperwork on the desk. Years of reading courtroom dynamics had taught him to assess situations quickly. "Thought I'd surprise you." He turned to face Keller, extending his hand. "David Jenkins. Eleanor is my mother." His tone was polite, but carried an undercurrent of authority that made Keller straighten in his chair. "Richard Keller, branch manager," the man replied, his demeanor shifting instantly. The condescension that had colored his interaction with Eleanor vanished, replaced by a professional courtesy he hadn't bothered to show her. "We were just discussing a withdrawal your mother wants to make." David nodded, placing his briefcase on the floor and taking a seat beside Eleanor. "Is there a problem with the withdrawal?" "Well," Keller began, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk, "it's a significant amount. We have protocols for unusual transactions, especially when they might indicate potential exploitation of vulnerable clients." Eleanor's back stiffened. "I am not vulnerable, Mr. Keller. I taught high school mathematics for 37 years and managed the department budget for 20 of those. I think I can handle my own bank account." David placed a gentle hand on his mother's arm before turning back to Keller. "My mother is withdrawing money to help her sister with medical expenses. I'm curious about what exactly struck you as unusual about this transaction, considering her banking history." Keller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "As I explained to Mrs. Jenkins, large withdrawals from savings accounts can be a red flag for potential fraud. We're just being cautious." "I see," David said, his voice measured. "And what constitutes a large withdrawal under your protocols?" "Anything over $2,000 typically requires additional verification," Keller replied. David nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. And did my mother provide identification?" "She did, but—" "And is there any history of fraudulent activity on her account?" "No, but—" "And has she made similar withdrawals in the past without issue?" Eleanor spoke up. "Last year I withdrew $8,000 for roof repairs. No questions asked." David continued, "So to summarize, a long-standing customer with an impeccable banking history provides proper identification for a withdrawal that's well within her means and consistent with her past banking patterns, and you decided this required special scrutiny." By now, Keller's discomfort was obvious. A thin line of sweat beaded along his hairline. "It's not that simple. Banking regulations have tightened. We have to be vigilant." "Of course," David agreed, his tone reasonable. "Vigilance is important, but so is treating all customers with equal respect and dignity." An uncomfortable silence filled the glass office. Through the transparent walls, Eleanor noticed that several people in the lobby were watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Tammy, the teller who had known Eleanor for years, was looking on with concern from her window. Keller cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply trying to ensure Mrs. Jenkins understood the implications of withdrawing such a large sum in cash." "My mother understood perfectly," David said quietly. "What I find concerning is that you seem to assume she didn't. I'm curious about what factors led to that assumption." The implication hung heavy in the air. Keller's eyes darted between mother and son. "I didn't assume anything," he said defensively. "It's standard procedure." "Is it standard procedure to suggest customers bring family members to help them understand their own finances?" David asked. "Several people heard you make that suggestion to my mother. Was that also standard procedure?" Eleanor sat straight-backed and dignified beside her son, a lifetime of facing subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination evident in her composed expression. She had taught her son from childhood to stand up for himself with grace and intelligence rather than anger, a lesson he had clearly taken to heart. Keller's face flushed red. He turned to his computer and began typing rapidly. "I'll process your withdrawal right away, Mrs. Jenkins. I apologize for any inconvenience." But David wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "I don't think it's inconvenience you should be apologizing for, Mr. Keller." Eleanor's son crossed the bank lobby with purposeful strides, his presence commanding attention. Dressed in a tailored navy suit with a leather briefcase in hand, he looked every bit the accomplished attorney he was. Relief washed over Eleanor's face as he approached, though she also felt a twinge of embarrassment that he was seeing her in this situation. "I thought you were in court today," she said, her voice softer than usual. "Finished early," he replied, his eyes quickly taking in the scene, his mother's tense posture, the manager's defensive stance, the paperwork on the desk. Years of reading courtroom dynamics had taught him to assess situations quickly. "Thought I'd surprise you." He turned to face Keller, extending his hand. "David Jenkins. Eleanor is my mother." His tone was polite, but carried an undercurrent of authority that made Keller straighten in his chair. "Richard Keller, Branch manager, the man replied, his demeanor shifting instantly. The condescension that had colored his interaction with Eleanor vanished, replaced by a professional courtesy he hadn't bothered to show her. "We were just discussing a withdrawal your mother wants to make." David nodded, placing his briefcase on the floor and taking a seat beside Eleanor. "Is there a problem with the withdrawal?" "Well," Keller began, his fingers tapping nervously on the desk, "it's a significant amount. We have protocols for unusual transactions, especially when they might indicate potential exploitation of vulnerable clients." Eleanor's back stiffened. "I am not vulnerable, Mr. Keller. I taught high school mathematics for 37 years and managed the department budget for 20 of those. I think I can handle my own bank account." David placed a gentle hand on his mother's arm before turning back to Keller. "My mother is withdrawing money to help her sister with medical expenses. I'm curious about what exactly struck you as unusual about this transaction, considering her banking history." Keller shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "As I explained to Mrs. Jenkins, large withdrawals from savings accounts can be a red flag for potential fraud. We're just being cautious." "I see," David said, his voice measured. "And what constitutes a large withdrawal under your protocols?" "Anything over $2,000 typically requires additional verification," Keller replied. David nodded thoughtfully. "Interesting. And did my mother provide identification?" "She did, but—" "And is there any history of fraudulent activity on her account?" "No, but—" "And has she made similar withdrawals in the past without issue?" Eleanor spoke up. "Last year I withdrew $8,000 for roof repairs. No questions asked." David continued, "So to summarize, a long-standing customer with an impeccable banking history provides proper identification for a withdrawal that's well within her means and consistent with her past banking patterns, and you decided this required special scrutiny?" By now, Keller's discomfort was obvious. A thin line of sweat beaded along his hairline. "It's not that simple. Banking regulations have tightened. We have to be vigilant." "Of course," David agreed, his tone reasonable. "Vigilance is important. But so is treating all customers with equal respect and dignity." An uncomfortable silence filled the glass office. Through the transparent walls, Eleanor noticed that several people in the lobby were watching the exchange with undisguised interest. Tammy, the teller who had known Eleanor for years, was looking on with concern from her window. Keller cleared his throat. "Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding. I was simply trying to ensure Mrs. Jenkins understood the implications of withdrawing such a large sum in cash." "My mother understood perfectly," David said quietly. "What I find concerning is that you seem to assume she didn't. I'm curious about what factors led to that assumption." The implication hung heavy in the air. Keller's eyes darted between mother and son. "I didn't assume anything," he said defensively. "It's standard procedure." "Is it standard procedure to suggest customers bring family members to help them understand their own finances?" David asked. "Several people heard you make that suggestion to my mother. Was that also standard procedure?" Elena sat straight-backed and dignified beside her son, a lifetime of facing subtle and not-so-subtle discrimination evident in her composed expression. She had taught her son from childhood to stand up for himself with grace and intelligence rather than anger, a lesson he had clearly taken to heart. Keller's face flushed red. He turned to his computer and began typing rapidly. "I'll process your withdrawal right away, Mrs. Jenkins. I apologize for any inconvenience." But David wasn't finished. He leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "I don't think it's inconvenience you should be apologizing for, Mr. Keller." The tension in the glass office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Keller's face had gone from red to ashen as he realized the situation was spiraling beyond his control. What had begun as a routine transaction, or what should have been routine, had escalated into a potential legal nightmare. "I'm sure that won't be necessary," he stammered, reaching for his phone. "Let me call the regional director myself. Perhaps we can resolve this today." David shook his head. "I think it's best if we contact them independently. But first, I'd like you to explain exactly why you felt it necessary to question my mother's financial judgment when her banking history shows nothing but responsible management." Elena sat quietly beside her son, her handbag clutched in her lap. She felt a complex mix of emotions: embarrassment at being treated like she was incapable, anger at the thinly veiled discrimination, but also deep pride in her son's composed handling of the situation. It's standard procedure to verify large withdrawals, Keller repeated, his excuse wearing thinner each time. You keep saying that, David replied, but procedure doesn't explain why you suggested my mother needed someone to help her understand her own finances. That goes beyond verification into something else entirely. By now, the bank's security guard had approached the office, looking uncertain about whether he should intervene. Behind him, the growing crowd of onlookers had begun whispering among themselves. Phrases like, "not right," and "treated her badly" drifted through the open door. Tammy, who had remained in the office, spoke up again. "Mr. Keller, Mrs. Jenkins comes in every month. She's never had issues managing her account. In fact, she catches mistakes that we sometimes miss." Elena gave Tammy a grateful smile. In a world where people often looked away from uncomfortable situations, this young woman's willingness to speak up meant more than she could express. Keller's phone rang, startling everyone. He answered it quickly, turning slightly away from the group. "Yes, sir. Yes, he's here now." "I understand. Right away." He hung up and faced David and Eleanor again, his expression now carefully neutral. "That was Mr. Phillips, our regional director. He's on his way here now and would like to speak with you both. He apologizes for any inconvenience and asks if you'd be willing to wait in our conference room where it's more private." David looked at his mother, raising an eyebrow in silent question. Elena nodded. She had no intention of leaving before this matter was properly addressed. "We'll wait," David said. "But I'd like to be clear about something, Mr. Keller. This isn't about inconvenience. This is about dignity and equal treatment." The security guard led them to a spacious conference room toward the back of the bank. Through the glass walls, Eleanor could see Keller hurriedly straightening his tie and desk, clearly preparing for his superior's arrival. Once seated in the conference room, David turned to his mother. "Are you okay, Mom? We can leave if you want. Deal with this another way." Eleanor shook her head firmly. "I'm staying. This isn't just about me, David. It's about every person who looks like me who walks into this bank. If I walk away now, nothing changes." David squeezed her hand, pride evident in his eyes. His mother had always been like this, strong, principled, unwilling to accept injustice even when it would be easier to let it go. It was from her that he had learned to stand his ground, to speak truth to power with dignity rather than rage. A woman from the bank brought them water and apologized profusely for the wait. Through the glass, they could see activity at the front entrance as a man in an expensive suit hurried in, looking concerned. The regional director had arrived. Judge Bradley, who had given David his card earlier, appeared at the conference room door. "Mind if I join you? I think Mr. Phillips should hear what I witnessed as well." David welcomed him in, and as they waited, several other customers approached, asking if they could provide statements about what they had seen. What had begun as one woman's humiliation was transforming into something more powerful, a community standing together against discrimination that too often went unchallenged. Elena watched it all unfold with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. She had walked into the bank alone that morning, expecting nothing more than a routine transaction. Instead, she had become the catalyst for what felt like a small but significant moment of change. As Mr. Phillips entered the conference room with an expression of grave concern, Eleanor sat up straight, ready to speak her truth. Mr. Phillips, the regional director, was a tall man with silver hair and glasses that sat low on his nose. He entered the conference room with quick, purposeful steps and a deeply concerned expression. "Mrs. Jenkins, Mr. Jenkins," he said, extending his hand to each of them. "I'm Robert Phillips. I'm terribly sorry about what's happened today. I came as soon as I heard." He turned to acknowledge Judge Bradley with a surprised but respectful nod. "Your Honor, I didn't expect to see you here." "I happened to be in line during the incident," Judge Bradley explained. "What I witnessed concerned me enough to offer my support to Mrs. Jenkins and her son." Mr. Phillips looked even more troubled at this news. He took a seat across from Eleanor and David, placing his hands flat on the table. "I'd like to hear exactly what happened, in your words," he said to Eleanor. "Every detail matters." Eleanor straightened her pearl necklace, a habit from decades of addressing school administrators. She recounted the story from the beginning, how she had come to withdraw money for her sister's medication, how Keller had questioned her judgment, suggested she was confused, and ultimately recommended she bring someone to help her understand her finances. As she spoke, Mr. Phillips's expression grew increasingly grim. He didn't interrupt, didn't try to explain away Keller's behavior, just listened with full attention. When she finished, he turned to Judge Bradley. "And you witnessed this, Your Honor?" The judge nodded. "Not all of it, but enough. I heard Mr. Keller suggest that Mrs. Jenkins bring a family member to help her understand her finances." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable. Several other customers heard it too. David spoke up. "What concerns me most is that this appears to be discriminatory behavior. My mother has banked here for 40 years without incident. She made a larger withdrawal last year with no questions asked. What changed, Mr. Phillips? Was it the new management?" The regional director sighed heavily. "We've had some complaints about Mr. Keller before, though nothing this serious. He was transferred here from another branch 3 months ago." Through the glass walls, they could see Keller sitting stiffly at his desk, pretending to work while obviously watching their meeting. "Complaints of a similar nature?" David asked pointedly. Mr. Phillips hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, nothing that reached this level, but there have been concerns about his differential treatment of certain customers." "By certain customers, you mean elderly black customers?" David pressed. The director didn't flinch from the direct question. "Yes, primarily elderly customers of color. We addressed it with him previously, but clearly not effectively enough." Eleanor felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. On one hand, she wasn't imagining things. Keller's treatment of her was part of a pattern. On the other hand, it was disheartening to know that such behavior had been allowed to continue. "What happens now?" she asked quietly. Mr. Phillips straightened in his chair. "First, I want to offer my deepest apologies, Mrs. Jenkins. What happened today was unacceptable and does not reflect the values of this institution." "Apologies are important," David said, "but they're not enough. What concrete steps will be taken to ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else?" The regional director nodded in agreement. "Mr. Keller will be placed on immediate administrative leave pending a full investigation. Based on what I've heard today, I don't anticipate he'll be returning to a customer-facing role." Tammy knocked gently on the conference room door and entered with a manila folder. "I pulled Mrs. Jenkins's transaction history for the past 5 years," she said, handing it to Mr. Phillips. "As you can see, she's made several large withdrawals before without any special scrutiny." Mr. Phillips reviewed the documents, his frown deepening. "This makes the situation even more concerning." He looked up at Eleanor. "I'd like to offer more than just words, Mrs. Jenkins. Our bank needs to do better, for you and for all our customers." He outlined a plan: sensitivity training for all staff, a review of policies regarding transaction verification to ensure they were applied equally to all customers, and a community advisory board that would include local residents to provide feedback on bank practices. And, he added, "We would like to cover your sister's medical expenses for the next 6 months as a gesture of goodwill. It's the least we can do after today's experience." Eleanor was momentarily speechless. She looked at David, who gave her an encouraging nod. "That's very generous," she finally said. "But what matters most to me is knowing that no one else will go through what I experienced today." Mr. Phillips met her gaze directly. "You have my word on that, Mrs. Jenkins, and I hope you'll consider joining our community advisory board. We need voices like yours." 2 weeks after that fateful day at First National Bank, Eleanor sat at her kitchen table, sorting through mail. Sunlight streamed through lace curtains that had hung in this window for 20 years, casting dappled patterns across the wooden tabletop. A small stack of envelopes sat to her right: bills, advertisements, a letter from her sister thanking her for the medicine money. The doorbell rang, pulling Eleanor from her thoughts. She opened the front door to find Tammy, the bank teller, standing on her porch with a bouquet of yellow roses. "Mrs. Jenkins, I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I asked Mr. Phillips for your address," Tammy said, offering the flowers. "I just wanted to check on you." Eleanor welcomed her in with a warm smile. "That's very thoughtful, dear. Come sit down. I'll put on some tea." In the kitchen, as Eleanor filled the kettle, Tammy shared the latest news from the bank. Keller had been transferred to a non-customer position at corporate headquarters. The entire staff had completed the first round of sensitivity training led by a respected community advocate. Most importantly, the new Community Advisory Board was forming, with its first meeting scheduled for the following month. "Mr. Phillips was hoping you'd reconsider joining the board," Tammy said, accepting a steaming cup of tea. "He says your perspective would be invaluable." Elena stirred honey into her own cup, considering the invitation. "I'm still thinking about it. At my age, you become careful about where you spend your energy." The phone rang, and Eleanor excused herself to answer it. It was David, calling with more updates. After listening for a moment, she turned to Tammy with raised eyebrows. "It seems your Mr. Phillips has been busy," she said after hanging up. "David says the bank is implementing new training procedures for all their branches in the state, not just our local one." Tammy nodded eagerly. "It's true. What happened with you has sparked real changes. You wouldn't believe how many customers have come forward with similar stories since then." Eleanor wasn't surprised. For every person who spoke up, she knew there were dozens who simply walked away, nursing private hurts and indignities. Later that afternoon, Eleanor visited her sister Grace to check on her recovery. Grace's small apartment was filled with family photos, including many of their childhood in the South, where their parents had taught them to hold their heads high despite the discrimination they faced daily. "The medicine is working wonders," Grace said, pouring coffee for them both, "and that bank covering 6 months of costs. I nearly fell out of my chair when you told me." Elena smiled. "It wasn't about the money, though. It was about being seen as a person deserving of respect." "Just like Mama always said," Grace nodded. "Dignity isn't something anyone can give you or take away. It's about how you carry yourself." That evening, as dusk settled over her neighborhood, Elena sat on her porch swing thinking about the past 2 weeks. Judge Bradley had called twice to check on her. 3 other elderly customers from the bank had reached out through David, sharing their own experiences and thanking her for speaking up. The local community newspaper had run a small story about the incident without naming names, focusing instead on how banks could better serve diverse elderly customers. Elena had kept a copy, folded neatly in her Bible. As darkness fell, she made her decision. She would join the advisory board after all. Not for herself, but for all those who couldn't or wouldn't speak up, those who simply took their humiliation home with them and added it to a lifetime's collection of small injustices. The following Monday, Eleanor dressed carefully in her best blue suit, the one she'd worn to David's law school graduation. She pinned on the silver brooch her late husband had given her for their 25th anniversary. Today was the first meeting of the Community Advisory Board, and Eleanor Jenkins intended to make her voice heard. When David arrived to drive her to the bank, he found his mother already waiting on the porch, her posture as straight as it had been when she commanded classrooms of teenagers. "You look like you're heading into battle," he teased gently. Elena smiled, her eyes bright with purpose. "Not battle, dear. Just change. One conversation at a time." As they drove to the bank, Eleanor thought about how a simple errand had turned into something much bigger. Life was funny that way. Sometimes humiliation could be transformed into power, and sometimes being in the wrong place at the wrong time turned out to be exactly where you needed to be. The bank came into view, its grand stone facade gleaming in the morning sun. Elena straightened her shoulders. She was ready.